suspect that he was mildly intoxicated.
Okay. And in relation to the tests you did, was there also a test done to determine any drugs or alcohol that might be in his system? Is that part of your treatment?
It is certainly typical in trauma cases. I would have to review the record to know the results of that.
Okay. Go ahead and just let me know when you're ready.
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay, so did you know anything in the lab report regarding alcohol or ethanol?
Yes, I've documented that his blood alcohol level is 92.
Okay, would that be equivalent to a BAC of 0.092?
Yes.
Any other drugs or anything extraordinary about those labs?
I also documented that the urine toxicology screen is positive for cannabinoids.
Okay. Would that be marijuana or THC? How would that be distinguished?
That suggests marijuana, yes.
Okay. And that would be in the urine, you said?
Yes, that was part of a urine toxicology screen.
So let me ask you, Doug, if it's in the urine, does it have any effect on a person's body?
That's not able to be determined by that test.
Okay, so you can't say if there's THC actually active in the person's body if it's just in the urine?
Correct.
Anything else in those labs?
Nothing with regards to drugs or alcohol.
Okay.
And I did notice that I made an error earlier when I stated I did not repair that laceration. I believe I did.
You did? Okay. And what did you do to repair it?
I didn't actually read that note yet. I can, again, refer to this.
Please.
I loosely closed the anterior bullet wound with a simple interrupted suture of nylon and a posterior wound with 3 sutures.
Okay. 3 stitches, essentially?
Yes.
To close it up? Thank you. Overall, what was Nick Prado's demeanor as you treated him?
My documentation indicates he was pleasant.
All right. Let me go to the next. Did that end your intervention, medical intervention with Mr. Prado?
Yes.
Okay. Let me ask you about Nick Peering. Was that another patient that you saw that evening?
Yes.
And I guess when I say that evening, this was now the early morning hours of October 9th, correct?
Correct.
So as to Nick Peering, describe what you observed as far as injuries.
Well, he had 2 gunshot wounds to his right upper extremity, by which I don't mean to imply that he was shot more than one time there, but that we observed 2 puncture wounds to his right upper arm, close to his shoulder. Again, I'd like to refer to the record just to make sure I describe them accurately.
Sure.
Yeah, so one wound was on the outside of his arm on the deltoid, and the other one was in what I describe as the posterior axilla, so the back of his armpit.
Okay, so let's just take that one first. So you pointed to your right arm, indicating, was it his right arm that had that wound?
Yes.
All right. And you mentioned earlier you couldn't tell, or you can't tell today, whether or not that was one or multiple gunshots?
Correct.
All right. At any rate, there was a wound on one side of the arm and then a wound on the other side of that same arm?
Yes.
All right. What other injuries did you observe, if any?
So he had a gunshot wound to the left pelvis. He had a puncture wound to the left lateral superior iliac crest, so that's the rim of the pelvis, very much to the side. And then another puncture wound from a bullet to the upper part of his left buttock.
Okay, so again, there are 2 wounds this is his left hip area, is that correct?
Correct.
And you're not able to say whether or not those are from different bullets or the same bullet at this point?
That's correct.
When you received Nick Peering as a patient, did you notice, had he received any medical intervention before you saw him?
Yes, or I don't know who placed it, but he had a bandage and a tourniquet placed to his right upper arm above the bullet wounds to his right arm.
And what would be the purpose of a tourniquet?
To stop bleeding.
Okay, just to the right arm that you indicated had an injury?
Yes.
All right. Anything on his left hip area?
I'll refer to my note again. I don't specifically refer to or describe how that wound was dressed in my note.
All right, thank you. And so as part of your treatment, did you remove the tourniquet to dress that wound?
Yes.
And what was the process to do? Is there some staging that has to happen? Are you concerned when you remove a tourniquet?
Well, certainly we're concerned about more significant hemorrhage, and so that's something that we wanted to do slowly and carefully. There's also some potential for what we call reperfusion, which is his arm now has not had good blood flow since the tourniquet was applied, and so all the cold blood that's had, lost all its oxygen and given up its glucose and all that is still in that arm, and that's returning to the body. So we just want that to come in a somewhat measured fashion to reduce the impact on somebody that we're concerned about their health status. Okay.
So while you removed that tourniquet, was there any complications?
No.
All right. Well, let me ask you, what were the major concerns as you observed these two injuries? What were your major concerns with those two injuries to his body?
Well, again, both of these are potentially very severe injuries. The right upper arm has important large blood vessels and important large nerves, all of which could potentially be damaged in this kind of a wound. The wounds in the area of his pelvis, we of course worry about, again, large blood vessels there that go to the lower body and the legs. We worry about the bone of the pelvis and the structure of the pelvis itself. And then large nerves, potentially involvement of intestines in that area.
Okay, and so what did you do to try to determine what injuries were happening internally?
Well, with regards to the pelvis wound, again, I'll refer to my note. Okay. We performed CT scanning, actually including the chest, abdomen, and pelvis. And with regards to his arm, we just did an X-ray of his right upper arm.
Okay. And what were the results of that imaging?
So the X-ray of the right upper arm just showed some swelling, but no fracture. The CT scans of the chest, abdomen, and pelvis demonstrated, again, soft tissue gas or air along the backside of the pelvis on the left, and extending into the left gluteal region. There was a fracture through the left ilium, the left sort of large wing of the pelvis. There was a hematoma, which is a collection of blood in the muscles of the left gluteus.
Okay, and of those things that you mentioned just now, what was the most serious or potentially serious injury?
Well, anytime you have an open fracture of any bone that's at significant risk for infection. So that was probably the most significant of the injuries we identified there.
Okay. And so what was the treatment plan going forward?
Well, the patient was provided IV antibiotics in the emergency department, and he was admitted. He was evaluated by the trauma surgeons and admitted to the orthopedic service for evaluation by them.
Okay. Let me ask you about Mr. Peering. I don't know if I asked you this before, but was he awake when you saw him?
Yes, he was.
All right. And what was his demeanor like when you treated him?
Again, referring to my notes, I indicate that he is alert, cooperative, pleasant, and uncomfortable appearing young gentleman.
Okay. Did you know any alcohol intoxication or impairment?
I'm looking at my note again. I don't describe any evidence of that.
Okay. Were there also labs done for Mr. Peering like you had discussed with Mr. Prado?
Yes, there were. He had a blood alcohol level of 208 or 0.208, and I don't see that I documented a urine toxicology screen.
Okay, so the ethanol level, 0.208, nothing about any drugs in the urine that you see?
Well, I don't document that test.
Okay. Let me ask you, as a doctor, any long-term concerns with these injuries? And let's start with Mr. Prado. That injury to his neck, do you have any concerns long-term that with what that injury might cause to Mr. Prado's body?
Your Honor, relevance?
Serious physical injury, Judge. Element of the offense.
Let me see it. Come on up. Charged under forwardage. Temporary but substantial disfigurement. Five. You said Syria? Well, here's the thing.
Let me ask Doctor in a different way, going back to my question. Could Mr. Prado's injury to his neck, could that cause protracted nerve injury?
Yes, I mean, he could potentially face complications related to the injury of the sternocleidomastoid muscle on that side, which we know is injured, or the spinal accessory nerve, which runs with it.
All right, thank you. May I have a moment, Judge?
Yes.
That's all I have. Thank you, Doctor.
Mr. Davidson?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Doctor.
Hello.
I'll try to be as concise as possible so we get you back to the hospital. When Mr. Peering and Mr. Prado presented at the ED, there was a third young man who presented at approximately the same time, correct?
Yes,
His name is Kyle Zintek, correct?
I believe you.
Okay.
I don't know his name. I did not care for that patient.
All three of the young men were put into trauma bays, correct?
Yes,
There are 3 trauma bays located directly next to each other, aren't there?
yes,
And the only thing that separates them are curtains, correct?
yes.
You can hear people speaking from one trauma bay to the next, can't you?
With some limitations due to noise in the room, but yes.
With regard to Mr. Prado, let's assume hypothetically that the findings on his neck were the result of one projectile. You're not able to tell which wound was the entrance wound and which wound was the exit wound, are you?
My training is not to make that determination.
Similarly, you're unable to form an opinion as to the distance between Mr. Prado and the firearm from which that projectile was expelled, correct?
Yes,
Mr. Prado was discharged from the ED without being admitted to the hospital, correct?
yes,
The labs that were done regarding the level of alcohol in his system was done using a sample of venous blood, correct?
I don't have that documented. I would presume so. I don't think there was any reason to collect arterial blood on that patient.
It would be unusual to collect arterial blood under those circumstances, would it not?
Of that injury, yes.
Now, just to clear up some of the questioning regarding the cannabinoids in his system, if there's cannabinoids in someone's urine, they may or may not have cannabinoids in their blood as well, correct?
I believe that's true, yes.
Was there any test done of Mr. Prado's blood to determine if there were cannabinoids present?
No.
There was also law enforcement present at the hospital at or around the time these young men were being treated, correct?
Yes.
In the course of receiving his treatment at Flagstaff Medical Center, did the medical staff determine Mr. Prado's weight? Is that reflected in his record?
I believe well, let me review the record I have here. I would not typically record that in my note. I don't know what other notes are included in this packet.
If you don't have it, doctor, that's okay.
Yeah, I have no record of it.
Okay, no problem. Okay. Moving on to Mr. Peering, you noted, doctor, the presence of 2 gunshot wounds in his arm,
Correct.
not to suggest that there were 2 separate projectiles, correct?
Correct.
Again, same question. Assuming hypothetically that those 2 injuries to Mr. Prado's arm were caused by one single projectile, you don't have an opinion as to which wound is the entrance wound and which wound is the exit wound, correct?
That's correct.
Similarly, you don't have an opinion as to the range between the firearm from which the projectile was fired and either injury, or any of the injuries, rather, that you observed on Mr. Peering's body.
Correct.
You indicated, sir, that Mr. Peering was admitted to the hospital?
Yes.
In the course of his treatment and the collection of historical medical information, did Mr. Peering not provide inconsistent stories as to whether he used controlled substances?
Jackson Foundation.
How is foundation lacking?
Does he have personal knowledge
Of,
of a conversation with Mr. Peering?
Mr. Davidson, why don't you lay a little background?
Sure. You testified earlier about some of the results from the X-ray studies that were done, correct?
Yes.
And in reviewing the materials in front of you to be able to testify about that, you were looking at reports from the radiologist or radiologists who reviewed those studies, correct?
Actually, what I was referring to was my documentation of the radiologist's interpretation of the note. So during the course of my care of this patient, I don't have access to the final radiologic report. I have usually a conversation with the radiologist about the results of the imaging, which I review myself as well. And I had documented that in the record, and that's what I referred to. I do believe the formal reports may be attached here as well, but those were not available to me at the time.
Okay. But whether it's done through a verbal conversation with a physician in the X-ray department or through reading the radiologist's dictated report, you rely on the findings of the radiologist in terms of how you're going to proceed with the care you're going to provide.
Yes.
Okay. Similarly, you referenced some of the labs that were run with regard to ethanol and cannabinoids, correct?
Yes.
You don't obviously actually go down to the laboratory and do the blood tests, right?
Correct.
You rely on the reports that are generated and get reported to you, correct?
Yes.
Similarly, when there are other physicians at Flagstaff Medical Center who are involved in the care of your patient, you also rely on their reports with regard to the care that they're providing to that same patient, don't you?
Certainly.
Dr. Aldrich was the physician who admitted Mr. Peering, correct?
Dr. Aldrich was the trauma surgeon who evaluated this patient. I guess I don't know for sure if he ended up being admitted to Dr. Aldrich's care or to the care of the orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Cashmore.
Fair enough. We can agree, though, that Dr. Aldrich was involved in the care of Mr. Prado.
Yes.
Okay. And
I'm sorry.
did I miss
Mr. Peering.
Mr. Peering. I'm sorry. Thank you for correcting me, doctor. Now, backing up, with regard to your interaction and care for Mr. Peering, part of caring for a patient under these circumstances is getting a relevant medical history, correct?
Certainly.
And that includes history of drinking, smoking, and using controlled substances, correct?
Yes.
And what information was reported under your care, as reflected in your records, with regard to what Mr. Peering reported concerning his use of controlled substances.
Objection, relevance, may we approach?
Yes. Let's take this in a sidebar. Reported, please.